Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Dünyayı konuşuyoruz. Dünyayı EKOTÜRK ekranında buluşturuyoruz. Tabii Gazze'yi ne kadar konuşsak az kalır. Gazze'yi konuşacağız bu hafta. İsrail'in Gazze'deki akıl almaz vahşeti sürüyor. Son olarak İsrail Güvenlik Kabinesi Gazze kentinin işgal planını onayladı. Milyonlarca Filistinli için çok daha büyük bir felaket kapıda ki hali hazırda zaten 7 Ekim'den bu yana cehennemi yaşıyor Filistinliler, Gazze'liler. Bir yandan insani yardım alabilmek için bekleyen insanlar hedef alınmaya devam ediyor. Açlıktan bebekler, çocuklar ölmeye devam ediyor. Dünyadan tepkiler artarak devam ediyor ancak İsrail'i durdurmakta ne yazık ki yetersiz. Bu hafta çok kıymetli bir konuğumuz var. ABD'deki Brown Üniversitesi'nde Holokost ve soykırım konularında çalışmalar yürüten, bu alanda dünyada önde gelen bir otorite kabul edilen İsrail asıllı Amerikalı tarihçi Profesör Doktor Omer Bartov bizlerle olacak. Kendisi geçtiğimiz haftalarda çok ses getiren bir yazı kaleme aldı New York Times'ta. I'm a genocide scholar, I know it when I see it. Ben bir soykırım uzmanıyım. Soykırımı gördüğümde tanırım başlıklı bir yazıydı bu. Bu hafta bu yazısı üzerinden İsrail'in Gazze'de yaptıklarını konuşacağız. Professor Bartov, thank you very much. Welcome to my show and thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Professor Bartov, Israeli Security Cabinet recently approved the plan to take full control of Gaza, as you know, expanding its military operations despite growing criticism at home and abroad. I would like to begin, before coming to your recent article on New York Times, as I just mentioned, but I would like to begin with your broader assessments of what has been happening since the October 7. As a Holocaust and genocide scholar who has studied humanity's darkest chapters, how do you assess what has unfolded since the October 7 attack? What are you thinking, and maybe more importantly, what are you feeling at this moment in history?
Well, thank you for that. That's a good question as to the distinction between what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. What I'm thinking is that in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, I think there was a bit of confusion in the Israeli political and military leadership. But soon thereafter, the political leadership began seeing the attack by Hamas as an opportunity. One has to remember that until October 7th, Netanyahu, his numerous administrations, because he's been in power for a long time, believed that and persuaded his public and the rest of the world that he could manage the conflict with the Palestinians, that there was no need for any territorial compromise or any negotiations. It could be managed. And in part, that had to do with his own support for Hamas, his allowing money to come from Qatar into Hamas, which was used in part by Hamas to build this system of tunnels. That, of course, exploded on October 7th with the Hamas attack. And at that point, after some hesitation, it seems that Netanyahu and the people to his right began to think that this was an opportunity to find another solution to this problem, not through politics and territorial compromise, but rather through finally resolving Gaza by destroying it and evicting its population from Gaza altogether. And everything that we've seen since is actually an attempt to implement that idea. So Israel is not really pursuing the war goals that were originally declared by the government, which were to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages, but a different policy, which is to empty Gaza entirely of its population, meaning ethnic cleansing, to destroy it so nobody could come back anymore. And because those people can't leave, they have no place to go to, that becomes a genocidal operation. And I think we're seeing it unfolding in front of our eyes.
Unfortunately. Well, speaking of the genocide, Professor, your recent very powerful New York Times article, I'm a genocide scholar, quote, I know it when I see it. You didn't think in the beginning, saying there was no proof at that time that genocide was taking place in Gaza, but you warned at that time, I remember, that it could quickly devolve into genocide. What specific changes prompted you to update your assessments towards genocide, and by which legal and or moral terms do you now define it as a real genocide?
Right, so as I said, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there were two types of statements that were coming out of Israel. One was what I said, that there were the official war goals, and the other was a series of statements made by politicians with executive power and generals, which were about, we'll have to flatten Gaza, they will have no water, they will have no food, they will have no power, they're human animals and we would treat them as such, they're no uninvolved people, and so forth. And initially it was difficult to say whether those statements were just statements made in shock and anger at the attack by Hamas and the fiasco by the IDF, or were they meant seriously? And that's what I was warning about in November when I wrote a first article in the New York Times warning, as you cited. By May, it appeared to me that what was happening was that, in fact, the IDF was implementing those statements rather than the official war goals. And what we could see by then was that there was a systematic attempt by the IDF to destroy everything, not only places where Hamas was allegedly hiding, but rather systematically destroy schools, universities, public
hospitals,
buildings, of course,
yes.
Homes, and all of that. And as we know, recently there was a report by Physicians for Human Rights in Israel that showed that there was a deliberate attempt, largely successful, by the IDF to entirely dismantle the medical system in Gaza, which will have long-term effects as well on the health and well-being of the population. So if you think about it in terms of the genocide definition, which is the one that matters, the definition in the UN Convention of 1948, it speaks about acts carried out with the intent to destroy a particular group, in this case it would be the Palestinians, in whole or in part, as such. And that includes killing members of the group, it includes causing harm to them, it includes creating conditions that will make it impossible for them to live. And all of this is, in fact, happening on the ground. And I reached that conclusion in May of 2024, when the IDF moved into Rafah, into the southernmost city of Gaza, which by then had 1 million people in it, most of them, half of the population, which were displaced from the rest of Gaza. And the IDF moved them from there to Al-Mawasi, to the beach area, which had no humanitarian infrastructure, and then proceeded to destroy Rafah. And that was a final indication that the goal was really just to flatten Gaza altogether, as had been warned at the very beginning of this war.
Professor, speaking of the UN definition, the word intent is a little bit, I think, maybe perhaps tricky here, because there are also some, of course, as you know, some counter-arguments. I read one, for instance, recently titled, "It's Not Genocide, a Response to Omer Bartov." I'm sure you have seen it. Some scholars argue that while Israel may have committed serious war crimes, its actions in Gaza do not meet the legal threshold for genocide. So this, I really wonder the word intent here. You're a genocide scholar, you're a Holocaust scholar. For instance, even probably Nazi Germany was not saying we are committing genocide, right? I mean, Adolf Hitler, like for instance, Adolf Hitler said that openly. What does this word intent really mean here? And if Netanyahu comes up and say, I don't have an intent, but his actions are conflicting with that statement, how can we make sure that this is a genocide, even though there is no declared intent?
Right, so as you say, often regimes and organizations that carry out genocide don't say that they're doing it. They say something else.
Right.
They say, well, it's a security threat. They say it's an internal enemy. They say we don't have a choice. They say those people attacked us and we have to respond, and so forth. In the case of Israel, what is interesting is that, first of all, statements were made right at the beginning. And people can ignore them or say, well, they weren't meant But all those statements were actually made on October 7th, 8th, 9th by people with executive authority, not simply people on the street or all kind of propagandists.
Right.
Secondly, those statements are still being made constantly. One has to distinguish, and that happens often with politicians, who is making the statements to whom. So Netanyahu, for instance, speaks very differently in English and in Hebrew. When he speaks in Hebrew, he is much clearer. Only in May, he said, we are destroying their houses. This May, in 2025. We are destroying their houses. They will have no place to go back to. And the only problem we have is to find countries that will take them in. So clearly the intent is ethnic cleansing, and clearly it's becoming genocidal because no country will take them in. But beyond that, because of the difficulty often, not in the case of Israel, but often, to find clear statements by leaders because of the reluctance to make them, the other way of determining intent is by seeing a pattern of operations. And that the ICJ, the International Criminal Court of Justice, has actually said that. So if you can find a pattern of operations that indicates that this is happening, and as I say, that pattern of operations became clear by May of 2024, then you can say, well, they may have not been so clear in their public statements, but that's the way they're operating. And I should add one last thing to this, that as of May 2024, the latest, the very fact that we are talking about the war in Gaza is itself an error, because there is no war in Gaza. The latest, May 2024, what there is a targeted destruction of Gaza because Hamas has lost by then, and since then, its ability to fight as an organized military organization. It has obviously some guerrilla activities, those can last for decades, but as an organized military, it's no longer in existence.
Right. Well, this is going to be a little bit long question, but this is something that I also want to ask you. You have drawn parallels between Israeli soldiers' dehumanizing attitudes toward Palestinians and the indoctrination of German soldiers in World War II. I really wonder what similarities do you see between the genocide the European Jews had endured during the Second World War and the genocide the Palestinians are enduring right now? And what these similarities, differences, do you also see between the two? And Professor Bartov, I recall Hannah Arendt's concept of banality of evil. Let me ask also, do you agree with her analysis of the German military and civilian bureaucracy's treatment towards the Jews during the Second World War? And do you think it applies to the Israeli state machinery's treatment of the Palestinian people?
So look, this is a complex question. I generally try to avoid analogies between various genocides and the Nazi genocide of the Jews. And I do that, as I've said before, because I think that when you do that, the Nazis always win out, because the Holocaust carried out by the Nazis, and not only the extermination of 6 million Jews, but also against many other populations, was so systematic and so widespread and so enormous that it's difficult to find any parallel to it. However, when you talk about genocide and you use the Genocide Convention, you don't have to make analogies. You don't have to say, well, if it doesn't look like the Holocaust, then it's not a genocide.
Right, right.
There is a definition, as I said, of genocide, and that's the one that matters, not whether it looks like it. Now, I made an analogy between what happens to soldiers, and I myself was a soldier for quite a few years, and how soldiers can be brutalized, how soldiers can be fanaticized, how they can be filled with particular images of the enemy that then make them behave in particular ways. And here, not in the way that the IDF is operating against Gaza, but rather in the way that its soldiers are behaving as a result of the education they received at home, and particularly as a result of the use of the Holocaust itself in Israeli education to create an image in Israel that any threat to that country is a threat of a Holocaust, that any threat could lead to Auschwitz, and therefore that you have to respond to it with complete brutality and ruthlessness, because otherwise you will end up in Auschwitz. That is the analogy that I was making. As for the banality of evil, what Arendt really identified, and what's important in her book on the Eichmann trial, of course, that's where the subtitle comes from, was that when you carry out genocide, there are many people who are participating in that who may be just bureaucrats. They're not particularly ideological. They don't necessarily hate those who are being killed. They're just fulfilling their jobs. And here I would say what you find in Israel is an aspect of genocide that people often forget. One difference between genocide and other crimes, say war crimes, which can be carried out by this or that military unit, genocide is a societal event. So everyone becomes complicit in some way. Whether you're a professor of the university, you're a member of the Doctors Association, you're a policeman, you're an intellectual, a journalist, working for the TV, everyone becomes complicit in that. And that's something, whether you believe in doing it or not, you become part of the process. That's why it's also so difficult to punish people for genocide, because you cannot punish an entire society, and you have to find individuals, representative individuals, as happened in Nuremberg in 1945, to represent this societal perversion and complicity in genocide.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is like a lesson for me. Thank you very much, Professor. It's a really honor. It's an honor for me to have you on my show. But I really keep coming back to the same haunting question, Professor. Was this preventable? Like, we often ask how the Holocaust, as we speak now here, how the Holocaust could have happened in plain sight, how the world watched and failed to act. And now, with Gaza, it feels like we are witnessing another tragedy unfolding in real time, on live screens, before everyone's eyes. Do you think this will be one of those moments future generations look back and ask, how could they let this happen? And was this really preventable?
Yes, of course, and I'm sure. And I'll say two things. It was preventable. First of all, it was preventable. That is, it didn't have to happen at all. And it was preventable when things began unfolding. One reason that I wrote that op-ed in the New York Times in November of 2023, warning, saying there were obviously already war crimes, but this could become a genocidal process, was that I was hoping that somebody would listen. The Biden administration at the time could have stopped it. Israel could not carry out this kind of violence for more than 2-3 weeks without constant support from, first of all, the US, also Germany, and other European countries. But it could have been prevented long before, because the core of the conflict, the reason that Hamas came into being, and I'm in no way, by the way, condoning the nature of the attack by Hamas, because nothing justifies killing 800 civilians. But the root of that is the occupation. If you occupy people, millions of people, for decades, all you can expect is that you are brutalizing them and you're brutalizing your own society. Both the occupier and the occupied are brutalized by this process. So this could have been stopped at the time, now, by a political process. Now, since then, what we see is extraordinary complicity by the very same countries that declare themselves to be the protectors of human rights and of international law, European countries and the United States, that now for almost 2 years have allowed this to continue without putting a stop to it, which is not difficult. It's easy to put pressure on Israel to stop, and they've not done so. And that will be a stain, obviously, on Israel, but also on those countries that became complicit in this genocide.
And how do we really explain it? Because still trying to understand, even though there are some reactions coming maybe stronger, like from the Western world, but still, especially United States, of course, through its continued unconditional military aid and political cover played a very, as you also pointed out, central role in enabling what we now describe as a genocide in Gaza. In your view, is this complicity rooted more in like political calculation, historical alliance, or moral blindness, as you also pointed out? And also we talked about Biden administration, but Trump's loyalty to Netanyahu, is it like a political alliance, do you see, or something deeper, like less transparent factors at play here, more than maybe ideological alignments, strategic calculation? How should we explain Trump's loyalty, I will use this word, to Netanyahu? How do you explain that?
Well, again, it's a very complex issue. I would not really speak about Trump's loyalty to Netanyahu or, for that matter, to anybody else. I don't think that's Trump's MO. He is loyal. I think his power over Netanyahu is precisely the fact that nobody knows what he might do next, not even Trump himself. So I don't think it's a matter of loyalty. And what is interesting is that just before Trump came into power, just before he moved into the White House, he forced Israel to accept a ceasefire, which Netanyahu did not want to do. Right. And that ceasefire actually led to the release of quite a few hostages. But then Netanyahu unilaterally broke the ceasefire, and Trump did nothing about it. And Trump, when he met Netanyahu, started sketching out this bizarre plan that if we move all the population out, then we can rebuild Gaza and make it into a nice resort area. And while Trump himself kind of forgot about that plan, in Israel, this was immediately accepted as license to doing exactly that. So Trump is difficult to anticipate, but what is the core reason for this support for Israel? I think, for one thing, we have to say that public opinion has changed dramatically in the United States and in Europe, including in Germany, which is Israel's biggest supporter in Europe. And that's not yet reflected in the policies of these governments, but it will be eventually. It takes time, of course, and certainly in democracies. The other thing is that, look, I mean, there has been historically support for Israel, and Israel has been very good at selling its case and saying, you know, the IDF is the most moral army in the world, and we're doing everything, we're trying to protect civilians, despite all the evidence. Right. Whereas the other side is not very good at selling its position. Have not succeeded as much as the government of Israel, partly because they don't have a government, to explain their case. There is also, in the United States and in Europe, a fair amount of Islamophobia. And so the result of that is that if you watch mainstream media, you would see that statements made by Israel are usually taken at face value, although they are often untrue, whereas statements coming from Gaza are always couched in terms such as the Hamas-supported health ministry, although the facts that they're giving are much more accurate than those coming out of Israel. Exactly. As I say, this is changing, but it is still a long process, and meanwhile, of course, news.
I see. So still there is time for these changes, like public opinion, also its impact on Western governments, but it will take time to see this implemented, reflected on real policies, maybe. So there is still time to see a real change on the ground.
It will take time, but the other side of it is one has to understand. The other side of it is that, first of all, you know, Israel spent decades building its case in Europe and in the United States. It wasn't immediately after the state was established. Right. And now its own case, its own international case, is being rapidly eroded, and it will be very hard for it to rebuild its reputation. The second thing is that because of the war in Gaza, there's rapid regime change in Israel itself. Israel is becoming increasingly an authoritarian state. It's not clear that the next elections are going to be democratic. There's a great deal of police violence, and it will become a full-blown apartheid state if it continues in this way, which will affect also Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Jewish citizens of the country. And if that happens, then Israel will not only lose support of its allies, it will even lose support of Jewish communities around the world that will want to distance themselves from that country. And so this course that it's taking is actually also dismantling Israel's position internationally and greatly weakening it internally.
Well, Professor, unfortunately, time is up, but I really appreciate your time. This was like a lesson for me. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, Professor Bartov.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta Profesör Doktor Omer Bartov'la konuştuk. Soykırım ve Holocaust özellikle üzerine çalışmalarıyla tanınan, bu alanda dünyada otorite olarak da kabul edilen Brown Üniversitesi'nden, ABD'deki Brown Üniversitesi'nden tarihçi Omer Bartov'la İsrail'in Gazze'de yaptıklarını konuştuk ki kendisi soykırım, açık bir soykırım olarak nitelendiriyor. Bu hafta kendisiyle İsrail'i konuştuk, Gazze'yi konuştuk. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla karşınızda olmak dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.